In this video, we're going to look at DeployExpert. I'm going to take you through a basic install of the product and configuration, and we'll just get a feel for the product. So right off the bat, the first thing that we need to understand are the basic requirements. And so you need SCCM 2007 Service Pack 2 at minimum. You need MDT 2010 with Config Manager integration. You need a network access account, and you need name pipes enabled on your SQL server. Those are the basic prerequisites for DeployExpert. Okay, so in terms of the install, it's pretty straightforward. It's just an MSI installer, and we'll walk through this wizard here. You accept the EULA, and you can choose where to install it to. I'll just leave it here as default and click install. And that basically copies the necessary files down to the hard drive, and what really the rest of the install process is run by this configuration wizard here, where we create the objects in the CM database and we create the DX database and we schedule some tasks and do other things. So the installer itself really just copies some files down, and this is where the actual install takes place. So, but before I run this configuration, I'm going to run this dxmoff update.exe. And what this does is actually edits your SMSDef moff file, which is what controls hardware inventory on your clients. So it makes a backup of before it does anything, and then it just goes ahead and adds a section at the bottom here called dx_pnp sign driver, and that is what DeployExpert uses, this new class. It's what it uses to get all of the information that it needs to perform analytics properly and really to function. So this is a critical piece. You have to run this, and then you've got to wait a bit for your clients to update their machine policy and pull down this new MOF file, and then you've got to wait for the hardware inventory to run in order for those clients to actually upload the hardware inventory to the SCCM database. So depending on your scheduling and how you've got your inventory cycles set up, this may take some time. It might take a week if you just sort of let everything happen manually. If you want to, you can go ahead and trigger some refreshes and whatnot on your clients, depending on your environment and your policies and how concerned you are about data flowing and all that other stuff. But this is a critical piece to understand, is that DeployExpert really won't work. The analytics won't work without this hardware inventory being present in the database, and to do that we edit this MOF file, and then that has to propagate out to the clients by way of machine policy refreshes. So that's critical. You've got to wait for all that to happen, or go ahead and trigger it manually, and if you're impatient like me, I imagine that's what you'll be doing, because I don't want to wait a whole week. Next, we'll run the DX configuration wizard, and as this is a clean install, the only option we have is to install DeployExpert. So I'll click next, and we see that it has gone ahead and figured out a whole bunch of stuff about my config manager environment. So it's found out the name of my config manager server and my site code and the SQL server that I'm running everything on, and the config manager database, and then it's suggesting that we call the DX database dx_red, which is my site code, red for Redshift Solutions. And I'll click next here, and we see that it's done some additional prerequisite checking, and it's said all good, all green. And when I click next, it's done some more prerequisite checking. This is another piece. You got to have your network access account set, so it's gone ahead and checked that. And this is nice. It's helpful because it'll show you if you're missing anything. And I will mention that everything gets logged here, so all of the install logic and all of these checks are being logged. And if you run into issues, you can go ahead and scour through those log files for more detailed information. So here we go. I'm going to click next, and this should just go ahead and do what it does. Creating some databases, running some other things, updating the registry, and Bob's your uncle. Click Finish, and there we go. We've installed and configured DeployExpert. So let's open up our Config Manager console and take a peek and see what I've done. One thing that it does, I'll just hop in here while we're waiting for the Config Manager console to open. It adds a scheduled task in here. And this just runs a executable called uniproc. And uniproc is really the brains behind a lot of the driver processing in DeployExpert. So uniproc interacts with the SCCM database, it interacts with the harvested drivers, and it kind of keeps everything synced up and functioning properly. So this scheduled task here runs every hour. And it just runs to process drivers that have been harvested and, integrate them into SCCM. Basically, the action is run uniproc. That's pretty much all it does. And you can run this manually if, again, like me, you're impatient and don't want to wait for every hour, especially in the early stages when you're testing things. But here's a critical piece to note. It runs as the system account. So what does that mean? That means that the SCCM server must have, the computer account of the SCCM server must have permissions in the DeployExpert database, because uniproc does stuff in the DeployExpert database. So if your SQL server is running on your SCCM server, then you're okay. But if you're like me, in my lab, my SQL server is a remote instance of SQL. And so later on, after we take a peek around in this console, I'm going to go ahead and actually create a new login on my SQL server for the computer account of my SCCM server and grant it DBO permissions to the DeployExpert database. That way, when uniproc runs, it'll have the permissions it needs to write and execute stored procedures and do all of the fancy stuff that it does. You'll quickly see errors in the uniproc log files if you don't do that step, and those errors are logged very well. So hopefully you'd be able to figure that out at that time and understand that it's a permissions issue. So we see that it's added a node here called DeployExpert, and this node, once it opens up, will show us all of the fancy features that DeployExpert contains. And so, right now we haven't really done anything with the product, so there's not much to show. So the first place you're going to want to go is into Profile Manager, and by default it actually creates a demo profile that points at all systems. So let me just scooch this over here a little bit so we can see more, and I'll maybe scooch that over here like this so we can get a better look. So the collection that it's limited itself on is all systems, and then we see we've got a whole bunch of default devices. By default, out of the box, DeployExpert is configured to ignore certain device types in its harvesting or in its analytics. So it's not going to consider that a battery or a 1394 or a mouse or monitor is going to contribute to make a difference between one compatibility class and another. So these are checked, and that means they are ignored. Only unchecked devices will be considered. So when you check something, you're saying filter that out. I want you to ignore it. And so down here we've got a list of devices that are filtered, and then based on the inventory that it finds in the SCCM database, it gives you a list of actually individual devices that you could say, okay, we'll always ignore this. And some of them that I know off the bat that you're going to want to ignore are things like this async adapter here. There is storage mini port drivers that I have just learned through experience based on me running a whole bunch of Hyper-V in my lab. That you see there's all these multiple instances of this mini port driver, and it seems to create a device ID with a unique GUID every time that this device or this driver is installed on an endpoint. So it'll make every single computer that's running Hyper-V be a unique compatibility class because it's got a unique device ID here, and you don't want that. So you just say, well, look, ignore those, and then you can save those filters and settings changes. And now let's see if we have any action here in our analyzer dashboard. So when I click Analyze, it's going to go and scrape through the SCCM database and try and figure out how many individual compatibility classes it can discover in the environment. And if you have, like, my lab isn't that big, so it's pointed at all systems, it's not that big of a deal. But if you've got thousands, tens of thousands, or potentially hundreds of thousands of computers in a collection that you've pointed a profile at, and you click this, you may generate a lot of database activity and run into issues. So I would say, especially at the beginning when you're getting this thing set up and configured, don't use the demo profile like I'm doing. Set up a test profile and have a handful of computers in there and just kind of get the feel for it, because you don't want to bring your entire config manager server to its knees just by running in analytics. So here we go. These are all red, and they are red because they have not been harvested. So, and this is kind of cool. Down here we've said, look, what is my target operating system? Well, it's Windows XP. And so up here, my Hyper-V host is not running Windows XP. It's running Server 2008. This Redshift LT is also not running Windows XP. So these are not candidates. They can't be harvested. I can't add it over here to be a candidate for driver harvesting, because DeployExpert's saying, look, these aren't XP. You can't harvest drivers from this to push back to an XP system, so it's not going to work. So let me just take a peek at what kind of state my lab is in here and see how many systems I've got. So let's see, what have I got in my Windows 7 systems? I've got some Windows 7 64-bit boxes. So let's go ahead and create a Windows 7 profile. So I'll say Windows 7 x64, and I'll limit it to, just to make things easier, my all Windows 7 x64 systems, and then I'm going to specify that it is a 64-bit operating system, and then I'll say create. And now it's going to create this new profile, and down here I'm going to have to tell it, look, no, not XP, I want you to look at Windows 7 and any of this type. And if you're, just in case you're curious, what is Enterprise N? That is me downloading something from MSDN and not looking closely enough. This is maybe a little known fact that Windows 7 Enterprise N was an edition of Windows 7 that had to be released in Europe that did not contain Windows Media Player because of some antitrust lawsuits. So I had downloaded this and thought I was getting Windows Enterprise, but it turned out it was Windows Enterprise without Media Player, so then I had to go and install it manually. Just for fun, because sometimes laptops have special mouse drivers, so I'm gonna uncheck that and say, no, I want you to consider that. And maybe some of my users have printers plugged in that I want to consider, and let's say USB devices as well. And then again, just for keeping things reasonable, I'm going to go down and filter out those storage mini port doodads and this async adapter here. Okay. 1, 2. There's a lot of them. Okay, there we go. Everything's looking good. I'm going to save that. It gives me a little warning and says, hey, you really want to do this? Yes. Now I'm in here and I'm going to analyze and see what I get. All right. So now you see they're blue, saying, look, this is a candidate, and I can harvest drivers from these guys because they are legitimate. So I've got a Lenovo laptop, I've got a DC7700, and I've got a VM, and they are all candidates that I could add to my candidate computers here, and then configure harvest jobs and grab the drivers off of them. So that is just a basic overview, how to install DX, how to get it running, and how to be successful off the bat by making sure that you have the minimum requirements configured and set properly. So I hope it's been informative, and we'll see you next time.